And where does India feature in this conflict? In the middle, again. Both Israel and Iran are very important partners for India, and there's all kinds of investments there, both political and economic. So picking a side is virtually impossible. And New Delhi's statement reflects this. Let me quote what the statement from India says. "We are seriously concerned at the escalation of hostilities between Israel and Iran. We call for immediate de-escalation, exercise of restraint, stepping back from violence, and return to the path of diplomacy." That's what the Indian statement says. No blame game, no criticism, no taking sides. India is basically asking both countries to de-escalate. And we'll get to the strategic considerations in a bit. But first, India has a more immediate concern. On Saturday, Iran captured a ship near the Strait of Hormuz. It's called the MSC Ares. Reports say the ship is linked to an Israeli businessman. So Iran seized it. Around 25 people are on board the vessel. 17 of them are Indian. So getting them released is a big priority. Indian officials have apparently reached out to Iran. They're trying to get the sailors released, which brings us to the larger issue. How will India navigate this conflict? If it's a short one, there isn't much to do. But what if Israel hits back? What if things escalate into a bigger conflict? Then India faces some tough choices. Let's look at three key factors: trade relations, political relations, and strategic relations. We start with trade. The India-Israel trade is around $7.5 billion. What about the India-Iran trade? It's around $2.5 billion, but there's a key difference here. Iran is sanctioned by Western countries, so India buys very little oil from Iran. Before the sanctions, trade was much higher at about $13 billion in 2015. Let's look at what this trade is made up of. Israel sells a lot of military equipment to India. In fact, New Delhi is Israel's top buyer. At the same time, Iran is an oil giant. If the sanctions are lifted, the energy trade can flourish again. So oil and weapons, two very important items that India buys from these two countries. Which brings us to the second factor, political relations. Prime Minister Modi has invested a lot in his relationship with Israel. In fact, he dehyphenated it. Until then, India could not separate Israel and Palestine. Both relations were interlinked. But Modi decided to separate them. In 2017, he went to Israel, and since then, Israel has become a key partner of India. With Iran, it's been a different trajectory. There are cultural and linguistic ties, long-standing political exchanges, and even shared history. There have been some uncomfortable statements and remarks, especially on Kashmir, but the relationship has largely been stable. And that brings us to the final factor, the strategic relations. India sees Israel as a gateway to Europe. Last year, at the G20 summit, India announced a new economic corridor. It would link India to Europe via Israel. Plus, both countries are part of a political grouping called the I2U2. India, Israel, the US, and the UAE, hence I2U2. It's also called the West Asian Squad. Now, with Iran, India has other shared interests. For starters, Afghanistan. Both India and Iran support the rights of Afghan minorities. They also oppose terror camps in Afghanistan. And like Israel, India sees Iran as a gateway, not to Europe, but to Central Asia. New Delhi is building a trading terminal in southeast Iran at the port of Chabahar. It is India's first ever overseas port investment. And how much is it worth? Almost $85 million. The plan is to use Chabahar to access Afghanistan and Central Asia. This way, India can sidestep Pakistan. So long story short, both countries are very important to India. There's a lot of money and strategic depth at stake, which is why taking sides won't be easy for New Delhi. If the fighting escalates, India will also have to think about its citizens. There are 18,000 Indians living in Israel, also between 5,000 and 10,000 Indians in Iran. If you add the wider Gulf region, a lot more. Up to 9 million Indians live in this region. And don't forget the energy trade. Around 40% of India's oil comes from West Asia, plus 70% of its gas. So a wider war would be a political and economic nightmare for India. Hence New Delhi's call for de-escalation. We've seen a lot of balancing acts from India recently, especially in Ukraine. But if this war drags on, it could be India's toughest challenge yet.